At 11:42 on the morning of May 1, 1943, smoke was already pouring from the belly of an American bomber over occupied France. Inside the aircraft, flames were spreading through the fuselage. And the only man moving toward the fire was the one everyone believed should never have been on that plane in the first place. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith was 31 years old. That alone made him unusual inside the bomber crews of the American air campaign over Europe. Most of the men flying missions in 1943 were barely 20. They were farm boys, factory workers, college students who had barely lived long enough to understand what war meant before finding themselves thousands of feet above Nazi-occupied Europe. Smith was older than almost everyone around him. Older, more stubborn, and according to nearly everyone in his squadron, completely useless. For 6 weeks he had been the outcast of the 423rd Bombardment Squadron. The man nobody wanted on their crew. The nickname came early. Snuffy. It came from a comic strip character famous for being lazy, argumentative, and impossible to manage. To the airmen at the base in England, the name fit perfectly. Smith argued constantly with officers. He skipped briefings. He lectured younger soldiers about politics and philosophy while they tried to prepare for combat missions that might kill them before the day was over. Most of the men in the squadron were barely out of high school. They didn't want philosophical debates. They wanted crew members they could trust with their lives. And they did not trust Maynard Smith. He hadn't even joined the military because he wanted to fight. Back in Michigan, a judge had given him a choice: pay the child support he owed, or go to jail. Smith chose a third option. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces. The decision put him in uniform, but it never made him a soldier. At least not the kind the Air Force expected. For weeks he sat on the ground while the rest of the squadron flew missions over Nazi-occupied Europe. Crew chiefs and pilots specifically requested that he not be assigned to their aircraft. If a plane needed a replacement gunner, they asked for anyone else. Anyone except Smith. But on the morning of May 1st, a crew was short one man. There were no other replacements available. And so the most unwanted airman in the entire bomb group finally climbed into a bomber. The aircraft was a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, the most heavily armed bomber in the American arsenal. 10 crew members. For massive engines. And defensive guns pointing in almost every direction. But even the B-17 had weaknesses. The most dangerous position in the entire aircraft was the ball turret. A glass and steel sphere hanging beneath the fuselage. The gunner curled inside it like a fetus, surrounded by aluminum and plexiglass barely inches thick. Below him was 25,000 feet of empty air. Smith was perfect for the position in one way. He was small. 5 feet 4 inches tall. Just small enough to squeeze into the turret. In every other way, the crew believed he was a liability. The man flying the aircraft that day was Captain Lewis Johnson. It was his 25th mission. One more flight and he would be finished with combat. 25 missions over Europe was considered a full tour. Most crews never made it that far. The math of aerial warfare was brutal. In 1943, the average American bomber crew had roughly a 50% chance of surviving the required 25 missions. Half would die before completing their tour. Some bomb groups were losing that many in a single month. The target that day was the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire on the French coast. Massive concrete bunkers that protected German U-boats. To American air crews, the place had a darker nickname: Flak City. Anti-aircraft guns surrounded the harbor. German fighters waited nearby for damaged bombers trying to escape. 78 American bombers had taken off from England that morning. Only 29 would successfully drop their bombs on the target. 7 would never return. By the end of the day, 75 American airmen would be dead or missing. The formation crossed the coast of France under clear skies. Bombs were dropped. The aircraft turned for home. But on the return flight, a navigation mistake changed everything. The navigator believed they had already crossed the English Channel. Believed the land below them was the southern coast of England. It wasn't. It was the heavily fortified port city of Brest. One of the most defended locations in all of occupied France. Captain Johnson began descending through the clouds. He wanted to drop below the weather before landing back in England. The bomber burst through the cloud cover at 2,000 feet, directly above the city. German anti-aircraft guns opened fire instantly. Black explosions filled the sky around the formation. Then the fighters appeared. 15, maybe 20 Focke-Wulf FW-190 diving toward the bombers with cannons blazing. The first shells ripped through the B-17's fuselage. The aircraft shuddered violently. A fuel tank in the left wing burst open. High-octane aviation gasoline sprayed into the radio compartment. A spark, then fire. It was the heavily fortified port city of Brest, one of the most defended locations in all of occupied France. Captain Johnson began descending through the clouds. He wanted to drop below the weather before landing back in England. The bomber burst through the cloud cover at 2,000 feet, directly above the city. German anti-aircraft guns opened fire instantly. Black explosions filled the sky around the formation. Then the fighters appeared. 15, maybe 20 Focke-Wulf FW-190 diving toward the bombers with cannons blazing. The first shells ripped through the B-17's fuselage. The aircraft shuddered violently. A fuel tank in the left wing burst open. High-octane aviation gasoline sprayed into the radio compartment. A spark, then fire. Flames raced through the aircraft almost instantly. Inside the waist section of the bomber, heat surged past 1,000 degrees. Smoke filled the narrow interior. 3 crewmen made their decision immediately. They jumped. Better the chance of a parachute over enemy territory than burning alive inside the aircraft. Their parachutes opened above occupied France. German soldiers watched them descend. None of them would survive the day. Inside the bomber, the remaining crew members fought to keep the aircraft alive. The tail gunner had been wounded during the fighter attack. He was trapped in the rear section of the plane, and the fire was spreading toward him. If the flames reached the oxygen tanks, the entire aircraft would explode. If the fire weakened the structure of the fuselage, the bomber would tear itself apart in the air. Every rule in the Army Air Force's manual said the same thing. Abandon the aircraft. Get out while there was still time. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith looked at the fire. Then he looked at the emergency exit. And instead of jumping, ricocheting off the interior of the aircraft, Smith was now fighting a fire while live ammunition detonated around him. And the German fighters were still attacking. Each pass of the fighters forced him to abandon the fire and run to the machine guns. He had never fired at an enemy aircraft before. Now he swung the gun toward the sky and pulled the trigger. Streams of bullets filled the air behind the diving fighters. Then he ran back to the fire. And again. Finally he realized something. The ammunition itself was feeding the disaster. Each box that overheated turned into a small explosion. So Smith did something no manual had ever suggested. He began picking up the burning ammunition boxes. With his bare hands, the metal burned his skin instantly. Blisters formed across his palms. But he carried the boxes to the gun windows and threw them out of the aircraft. One after another. Flames still spread across the floor. The fire extinguisher emptied quickly. There was almost no liquid left in the aircraft. Except one thing. The crew relief tube. A funnel connected to a pipe that vented waste outside the aircraft. Smith disconnected it and used the liquid to fight the flames. When that ran out, he simply urinated directly onto the burning metal. For 90 minutes the man everyone believed was useless fought the fire alone. One man, inside a burning bomber, with German fighters still attacking, and 6 other crewmen depending on him to keep the aircraft from exploding. Behind him in the cockpit, Captain Johnson fought a different battle. The bomber had lost control cables. The engines were damaged. The aircraft tried constantly to dive toward the ground. Johnson fought the controls with everything he had. They needed to reach England, but the English coast was still miles away, and the aircraft was barely holding together. Inside the bomber, the fire refused to die. Flames continued crawling along the metal floor of the aircraft, fed by gasoline that had soaked into every crack and seam of the fuselage. The heat was unbearable. Smoke filled the interior so thick that breathing felt like inhaling burning sand. Every few seconds, another round of ammunition detonated somewhere along the wall. Small explosions echoed through the aircraft. Each one sounded like a gunshot fired inside a steel room. Still, Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith refused to stop. His hands were already burned. The skin along his fingers had blistered and split open. Blood mixed with the soot covering his uniform. But the fire kept spreading. He grabbed another ammunition box. The metal container was so hot it nearly tore the skin from his palms. Smith dragged it across the floor, stumbling through the thick smoke toward the open gun window. For a moment he nearly collapsed. The oxygen inside the bomber had thinned drastically. Each breath felt smaller than the last. But he forced himself upright and hurled the ammunition box into the sky. The moment it left the aircraft, the box exploded in the air behind them. If it had detonated inside the fuselage, the entire aircraft might have shattered. Another fighter screamed past the bomber. A Focke-Wulf FW-190. Its cannons flashed as it fired into the formation. Bullets tore through the B-17 again. Smith staggered toward the waist gun. He had barely used the weapon before this mission. But now instinct took over. He gripped the twin machine guns and fired back at the diving fighter. The recoil slammed into his shoulders. Tracers cut through the sky toward the German aircraft. The fighter broke away before getting close enough to finish the damaged bomber. For a moment there was silence. Then Smith turned back toward the fire. The flames were lower now, but they were still burning across the floor. He grabbed another piece of canvas, dropped to his knees, and began beating at the flames again. This time something changed. The fire began shrinking. Slowly, painfully, but the orange glow that had filled the fuselage started to fade. Behind him the tail gunner groaned. The man had been wounded earlier when the fighters attacked. Shrapnel had torn into his leg. He had lost a terrifying amount of blood. But the worst danger was the fire. If the flames reached the rear of the bomber, the tail section would become a furnace. Smith crawled toward him through the smoke. The wounded gunner was barely conscious. His oxygen mask had slipped away from his face. Smith pulled the mask back over the man's mouth and nose. Then he dragged him forward through the narrow fuselage. It took nearly 10 minutes. Every movement felt like lifting dead weight through thick mud. But finally he managed to move the wounded man into a safer section of the aircraft. Another explosion shook the bomber. But this one came from outside. Anti-aircraft fire. Black bursts of flak still surrounded the formation. Because the bomber had strayed off course earlier, they were now flying through one of the most heavily defended areas of occupied France. The port city of Brest. German anti-aircraft batteries filled the coastline. Thick clouds of black smoke exploded around the aircraft. Each burst was designed to shred bombers with razor-sharp fragments of steel. One piece slammed through the fuselage only inches from Smith's head. Another tore through the radio equipment. The aircraft shuddered violently. Back in the cockpit, Captain Johnson wrestled with the controls. The bomber was barely responding. Control cables had been damaged during the fighter attack. One of the engines was losing power. The aircraft kept trying to roll toward the burning wing. But slowly, the coastline began to disappear behind them. They had finally escaped the worst of the German defenses. And ahead of them, hidden beneath a thin layer of clouds, lay the cold gray waters of the English Channel. Inside the fuselage, the fire was almost out. Only small flames still flickered along the metal floor. Smith collapsed against the side of the aircraft. For the first time in more than an hour, he allowed himself to breathe. His uniform was soaked with sweat. His hands were burned and bleeding. The inside of his lungs felt like they had been scraped raw by smoke. But the bomber was still flying. And the crew was still alive. After a few minutes he forced himself back to his feet. The work wasn't finished yet. The wounded gunner needed medical help. Smith ripped open the emergency first aid kit. Inside were bandages, morphine, and a few basic supplies. He wrapped the wounded man's leg as tightly as he could. Blood had soaked through most of the gunner's uniform. The bleeding slowed, but it didn't stop completely. There was nothing more Smith could do. The rest depended on how quickly they could reach England. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The bomber limped slowly across the cold waters of the Channel. Other aircraft from the formation passed them. Some damaged. Some missing engines. A few trailing smoke. The sky that morning had become a graveyard of bombers. Finally, the navigator spotted the coastline. England. Relief spread through the aircraft. But they still had to land. And the bomber was barely controllable. The landing gear system had been damaged. Hydraulic pressure was dropping. Captain Johnson turned the aircraft toward the nearest airfield. An emergency landing would be their only chance. Inside the fuselage, Smith secured the wounded gunner as best he could. Then he sat down for the first time since the fire began. His hands trembled uncontrollably. The adrenaline that had kept him moving for 90 minutes was fading. Pain rushed back into his body. Every burned finger, every bruised muscle, every breath that scraped against smoke-damaged lungs. Only then did the realization finally reach him. The man nobody trusted, the man everyone wanted off their aircraft, had just saved the entire crew of a burning Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. But the mission was not over yet, because bringing the damaged bomber safely to the ground would be the final test. Aircraft was barely holding together. The English coastline appeared through the haze like a ghost. Gray cliffs, dark water, and a narrow stretch of land that meant survival. Inside the battered Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, no one spoke. The crew was exhausted. Smoke still lingered inside the aircraft, clinging to every surface. The smell of burned metal and gasoline filled the air. For nearly 2 hours the bomber had been fighting to stay alive. Now it faced one last challenge. Landing. Captain Johnson kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. The aircraft was barely responding to the controls. The left wing had taken heavy damage. One engine was failing. The control cables were partially severed. Every movement of the control yoke felt unpredictable. The bomber drifted slightly to the left. Johnson corrected it. The aircraft lurched to the right. He corrected again. It felt less like flying and more like wrestling a wounded animal through the sky. Behind the cockpit, Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith forced himself back onto his feet. His body was screaming from exhaustion. The burns on his hands had begun to swell badly. Each finger throbbed with pain. But he ignored it. The wounded tail gunner still needed help. Smith checked the bandages again. Blood had seeped through the cloth. Not as heavily as before, but enough to worry him. The gunner's face had turned pale. His breathing was shallow. If they didn't land soon, the man might not survive. The navigator leaned forward inside the cockpit. There's an airfield 5 miles ahead. Captain Johnson nodded. He could see it now. A small Royal Air Force base carved into the green English countryside. But there was another problem. The landing gear. Damage to the hydraulic system meant the gear might not deploy. If the wheels refused to lower, the bomber would have to land on its belly. A belly landing in a damaged bomber loaded with fuel could easily end in disaster. Johnson flipped the switch. Nothing happened. He tried again. Still nothing. The hydraulic pressure was gone. The co-pilot looked back toward the crew compartment. Manual crank. Every bomber carried a backup system. A hand crank that allowed the crew to lower the landing gear manually. But it required brute strength. And time they barely had. Smith staggered forward through the aircraft. The manual crank was mounted along the side of the fuselage. He grabbed it with both hands. The metal handle bit into his burned palms. Pain exploded through his fingers. But he began turning. The mechanism groaned. Metal gears slowly began moving. Each turn lowered the landing gear only a fraction of an inch. The bomber was already descending toward the runway. They were running out of time. Smith kept cranking. Sweat poured down his face. His burned hands slipped against the metal handle. He tightened his grip and forced the crank around again. One turn. Another. Another. In the cockpit, a small indicator light flickered. One wheel locked into place. But the other was still halfway down. "Keep going," the co-pilot shouted. Smith's arms trembled with exhaustion. But he kept turning the crank. Every muscle in his shoulders screamed. Finally, the second wheel dropped into position. The indicator light flashed green. Both landing gears were down. Captain Johnson lined the aircraft up with the runway. The bomber descended slowly toward the ground. For a moment the aircraft drifted sideways. Johnson corrected it. The runway rushed closer. The entire crew held their breath. The wheels touched the ground. The aircraft bounced once, twice, then slammed back onto the runway with a violent jolt. The damaged bomber skidded forward in a cloud of smoke. Brakes screamed. Finally, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress rolled to a stop. For several seconds no one moved. No one spoke. Then the co-pilot laughed. A deep, exhausted laugh that spread through the cockpit. They were alive. Ground crews rushed toward the aircraft. Ambulances followed close behind. When the hatch finally opened, fresh air flooded inside the bomber. Smith tried to stand. His legs nearly gave out beneath him. Medics climbed into the aircraft and immediately moved toward the wounded gunner. They lifted the man onto a stretcher and carried him out. Another medic grabbed Smith's hands. The burns were severe. Blisters covered nearly every finger. The skin was blackened in several places. "Good God," the medic whispered. "What happened in here?" Smith looked around the interior of the aircraft. The fuselage was black with soot. Burned ammunition casings littered the floor. The smell of smoke still hung in the air. He shrugged slightly. "Just a small fire." The medics stared at him in disbelief. Because by that point the ground crews had already seen the damage. The aircraft should never have made it back. Half the interior had burned. The fuselage was riddled with bullet holes. Several sections of the floor were warped from heat. Yet somehow, the bomber had survived. And so had the crew. But the story of what really happened inside that aircraft had only just begun. Because in the coming days, the officers of the United States Army Air Forces would begin investigating the mission. And what they discovered would shock the entire bomb group. The man everyone believed was a useless troublemaker had done something almost impossible. The bomber sat silent on the runway. Smoke still drifted from the damaged fuselage. Ground crews surrounded the battered Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, staring at the destruction covering its metal skin. Bullet holes. Burn marks. Warped panels along the waist section. It looked less like an aircraft and more like something that had crawled out of a furnace. Yet somehow it had landed. Ambulances carried the wounded tail gunner away first. Medics followed behind with stretchers and equipment. Crew members slowly climbed down from the aircraft one by one. Some limped. Some coughed violently from the smoke they had inhaled. But they were alive. That alone felt like a miracle. Last to leave the bomber was Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith. He moved slowly. Exhaustion hung over him like a weight. His flight suit was black with soot. His hands were wrapped in temporary bandages the medics had placed over his burns. As he stepped onto the ground, several mechanics stared at him. One of them had already climbed inside the bomber to inspect the damage. The man shook his head in disbelief. How did anyone survive in there? Another mechanic pointed toward the charred waist section. That whole compartment burned. Smith simply walked past them. He didn't say anything. At that moment he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who needed sleep more than anything else in the world. Inside the operations building, officers quickly began questioning the crew. What had happened over France? How had the fire started? Why had several crew members bailed out? The answers came slowly. Each crewman described the same terrifying sequence. German fighters. Fuel tanks rupturing. Flames spreading through the fuselage. Exploding ammunition. And one man fighting the fire alone. At first the intelligence officers thought they had misunderstood. They asked again. The crew repeated the story. For more than 90 minutes, Maynard Harrison Smith had moved through a burning aircraft. He had thrown out ammunition boxes before they could explode. He had fought flames spreading across the floor. He had manned the machine guns whenever German fighters attacked. And he had continued doing it even after severe burns covered his hands. The officers looked at one another. Because they knew something the crew did not. In the entire history of the United States Army Air Forces, almost no one had survived a fire like that inside a bomber. Most crews abandoned the aircraft. That was the standard procedure. Yet this man had stayed. Not just stayed, but saved the aircraft. Saved the crew. Saved the mission. Meanwhile, Smith sat quietly in the medical station. Doctors cleaned his burns. They wrapped his hands properly this time. The pain was worse now that the adrenaline had faded. Every nerve in his fingers seemed to pulse at once. But the doctor's expression told him something else. "You're lucky," the doctor said. "Another 10 minutes in that fire and you probably wouldn't be here." Smith nodded slightly. He understood that. But what he didn't understand was why the entire base suddenly seemed interested in him. Over the next few days, investigators inspected the aircraft again and again. The burned fuselage told the same story the crew had described. A fire large enough to destroy the bomber. Yet somehow it had been contained. Finally, the commanding officers reached their conclusion. What happened inside that aircraft had not been ordinary courage. It had been something far beyond that. Weeks later, the official recommendation moved up through military command. Across the Atlantic. All the way to Washington. And on July 16, 1943, the decision became official. Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military honor in the United States, for actions inside a burning bomber over occupied France. The ceremony took place in England. Officers stood in formation. Airmen from the bomb group gathered nearby. Many of them were the same men who once refused to fly with him. Men who had called him lazy, unreliable, a problem soldier. Now they watched as the medal was placed around his neck. In the end, the man nobody trusted had done something no one else could. He had walked into fire. Inside a burning Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. And because of that decision, 8 men lived who might otherwise have died in the sky over Europe. History would remember many pilots, many aces, many famous battles of World War II. But among the countless stories of that war, few were as unlikely as the story of the man they once called useless. The man who refused to abandon a burning bomber. The man who fought fire with his bare hands. And the man who proved that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones nobody expects.